Hi guys, in this video I'm going to take you through some of the introduction to what organic chemistry is and how that applies to biology. So we did our review of basic chemistry. Now we're going to talk about what kind of chemistry makes up living things. Okay. So first, a good way to start is to talk about what organic chemistry isn't. Okay, so inorganic compounds are things that do not contain carbon-hydrogen bonds. So these may be found in living things, but they're not the main building blocks of all of the living things that we're going to be talking about. So some examples of these are CO2, or carbon dioxide, as shown here in that molecule diagram, one carbon bonded to two oxygens. No hydrogens bonded to that carbon, so that's what makes it inorganic. Sodium chloride, NaCl, is another example of something that's inorganic. There's no carbon, there's no hydrogen. That does not make it an organic compound. Sodium hydroxide, NaOH, is another example of that. You don't see any carbon-hydrogen bonds in that either. Okay, so any compound that does not bond together, carbon and hydrogen, is considered inorganic. Okay, so those are all the molecules that help the function of living organisms and stuff, but they are not the main building blocks of some of the organic molecules that we're going to be talking about. So organic compounds are all compounds that contain carbon-hydrogen bonds then. So if you have bonds between a carbon and hydrogen, you've got an organic compound. Usually these come from living organisms. Okay, so they're going to come from animals or plants, or some other living things. Some bacteria can produce these organic compounds. So living things use matter and energy to produce these organic molecules and then use them to drive all of our life processes, which was those Stern-Ger processes that you guys were tested on just last week. Okay, all of those life processes that we talked about rely on using and having and creating these organic compounds. Okay, so that synthesis, that transport, nutrition, all growth, all of that stuff cannot happen without these organic compounds, and some of those processes will produce these organic compounds. Okay, so some examples of these: carbohydrates. Okay, so things that are found in bread. Okay, all the very yummy stuff, the things that they tell you to stay away from. Lipids, so that would be any kinds of fats like oils and butter and stuff like that. Nucleic acids, which are all of the molecules that make up our DNA. And proteins are another example. Okay, proteins are things that are found in meat products and stuff like that. That's what helps your muscles grow and build upon themselves. And then underneath the umbrella of proteins, a specific protein that we're going to talk about is enzymes. Okay. So these are the four main categories of organic compounds. Okay, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, proteins. Those are your four organic compounds, or your types of organic compounds. Okay, we're going to talk about each of these in detail throughout this chapter. And then enzymes is a special kind of protein that we're going to talk about. So it's very important to remember that enzymes are still a protein. They're just a special kind of protein. Okay, I'm going to be saying that a lot when we talk about that. Alright, so some kinds of organic compounds that you have probably come in contact with in your lifetime. Okay, there's over 50 million different organic compounds, so it's very likely that you have come in contact with one at least once in your lifetime. And that number is growing. Okay, we're constantly finding new organic molecules and stuff as research is done. New molecules are discovered. So some examples of molecules that you have been in your bodies or you have come in contact with before. Okay, aspirin is a great example. So that is a pain reliever. So if you've taken an aspirin for any kind of pain relief, that is an example of organic compound. Caffeine. So in any of your soft drinks or coffees and teas, okay, have caffeine that you've most likely taken in caffeine at some point in your lifetime too. Other kinds of molecules like nicotine, that's found in tobacco, and morphine, that's a really powerful pain reliever there. Those are also examples of organic compounds. And notice a lot of them have like these ring structures. Okay, these rings represent carbons. So anytime that you've got like a little point on these rings, that's a carbon there bonded to some other molecules, usually hydrogens. If it was something else, it would be noted by the letter. Okay. So why do we have so many organic compounds? Why are there 50 million and growing organic compounds? Okay. Well, that's basically because carbon is a super versatile element. Okay. It can bond with a lot of different elements in a lot of different ways. Okay. So one of the ways it readily forms covalent bonds with itself and other elements. So remember, covalent bonds, they are sharing electrons in these kinds of bonds. And so you might want to make a note of that to remind yourself that covalent means they're sharing bonds, or sharing electrons. So it'll bond with things like sulfur and phosphorus and oxygen, nitrogen, carbon itself, hydrogen. Okay, it can bond with a lot of stuff. Now, it bonds easily because it only has 4 valence electrons. So from last year as a review, valence electrons are the outermost electrons in the atomic structure. So in a carbon atom, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 that are outside and available to bond with. Okay, and it wants to have 8 in this outer ring. Okay, so in order to get to that 8, it needs to bond with a lot of things, and it needs to be willing to do that in order to fill that up to 8. Okay. So it's very flexible in who it wants to bond with in order to achieve that. So carbon is able to form single, double, and triple bonds. Okay, so that means it can share 1 set of electrons, it can share 2 sets of electrons, or it can share 3 sets of electrons with other atoms and form other molecules. Right? So with that, that allows carbon to form things like chains, or so that would be things here like this methane, ethane, propane, butane, pentane. Those are all chains of carbon. It can form branched chains like this isobutane, isopentane. Those are branched chains. Okay, or it can form kinds of rings structures. So cyclopropane, cyclobutane, cyclopentane. Okay, all of those are ring structures, or it can form complexes of rings. So in like the caffeine example and the aspirin example that we saw a slide or two ago, all of those are complexes of rings, so multiple rings bonded to each other to form a larger compound. Okay. So carbon forms a lot of isomers. Okay, so isomers are things that have the same molecular formula but different arrangements of atoms. Okay, now this is not the same thing as an isotope. So we talked about isotopes in our chemistry review notes. Okay, so remember, isotopes are radioactive elements. They're things that have a different number of neutrons in their atomic nucleus. Okay, isomers are molecules. We're not looking at the atom specifically. We're looking at the whole molecule. So isomers are molecules with the same molecular formula, but different arrangements of atoms. Okay. So this happens a lot with carbon-based compounds because of the way that carbon can bond with so many things and in different orders. So an example of this is dimethyl ether and ethanol. Okay. So dimethyl ether is sometimes used as a substitute for propane and like other gas fuels and that kind of stuff. It has a formula of C2H6O. Okay. And ethanol is the alcohol that's found in like alcoholic drinks and disinfectants. So when there's alcohol and a disinfectant, it's ethanol that's in it. So ethanol is also C2H6O. Okay. They have the same exact formula, but they're 2 different molecules because the atoms within that molecule are arranged differently. Okay, so in dimethyl ether, you've got your carbon with 3 hydrogens, oxygen in the middle, bonded to another carbon with 3 hydrogens. Okay. Now, in ethanol, you've got your carbons right next to each other instead of the oxygen in between. So just moving that oxygen to the other side completely changes the properties of the compound. Okay. So if you need to pause the video here for a second to draw in these diagrams of these isomers, go ahead and do that. So carbon molecules that we're going to be talking about with carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and stuff, we're going to be talking about monomers and polymers. Okay. So monomers are the building blocks of all of the organic molecules that we're going to be talking about. Okay. So a monomer, if you break down that word, that mono prefix means one. Okay. Mono means one. So these are the small molecules. Okay. They're one single piece of the entire thing. Mono means one single piece. Okay. So these are building blocks of polymers. Okay. Now a polymer, that poly prefix, that means many. Okay. So these are the large molecules that are made of many monomers. Okay. So if it helps you in your notes, I would maybe draw out some pictures of this next to the definitions, because this is going to be super important when remembering the different kinds of monomers and polymers of all of the organic molecules that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to be using these two words a lot, so knowing the difference between them and what they mean is going to be super, super important. Okay. So I would highly suggest putting in some like drawings or diagrams or something next to these words in your notes to help you remember that. Okay. So monomer, single piece, polymer, the big long group of those little pieces put together. Now when we put monomers together to create a polymer, or maybe break a polymer apart in order to get the monomers out of it, we can have a couple different kinds of reactions. Okay. The first kind of reaction is condensation, or the other name for it is dehydration synthesis. Okay. So the way that I like to remember this, okay, the reaction takes a monomer plus a monomer and creates a polymer plus some water. Okay. So dehydration, I think of that as like taking away water. If you're dehydrated, you need to take in water. You did not have enough, so water is taken out of you. So if you do like a hard workout, you get dehydrated. So water is taken out. Okay, water is a product of this reaction. Okay, and the synthesis part, you create a polymer. Okay, so if you take a small molecule plus another small molecule, you get a bigger molecule, so that's the synthesis, and water is released, dehydration. Okay, so dehydration, synthesis, or condensation, those are the same thing. You can use those interchangeably. So water is always a product, or water is formed in this kind of reaction. Okay. Now the other kind of reaction that we can have is called hydrolysis. So hydrolysis is the breaking of water. So I remember this one by that hydro prefix tells me that water is being used somewhere here. And lysis, that lysis suffix means to break apart. Okay, so the breaking of water is what you get there. So this is the opposite of condensation, because you're taking a larger molecule, a polymer, and breaking it down into some smaller pieces. So what this looks like if we were to write it out in like a general equation, you would have a polymer plus some water, and that gets you a monomer plus a monomer. Okay, so it's the exact opposite of the condensation reaction. Okay, so if you took the condensation reaction of the previous slide and reversed it, you would get this reaction. Okay, so hydrolysis, you break apart water. Water is not a product. Okay, so you take a big molecule plus some water, you get two smaller molecules. Okay. So these will be important to remember when we're talking about building polymers and breaking down polymers to get energy and stuff like that, when we're talking about the different kinds of organic compounds later in this chapter. Okay. So that does it for our intro to organic chemistry there. Okay. What I'm going to have you guys do is show me your notes once you've completed this video, either on Zoom or send me a picture so I know that you are done.